I guess I'll introduce myself. My name's Chelsea, and I am the campus dietitian. And you can see all the little letters after my name. That stands for Master of Science, Registered Dietitian, Licensed Dietetic Nutritionist. And I am a part of the Student Health Center, and I'm a resource for students here on campus. I will meet with students about a huge variety of topics. And then I also work very closely with campus dining and do kinds of like programming and outreach and fun stuff like this. And I'm having green tea with ginger. So thanks for inviting me.
I'm Jake. I'm a peer educator. I'm majoring in environmental science and I'm minoring in sustainability. Yeah, I'm doing my presentation on flexitarian diets in the environment. Okay, so what is a flexitarian? So it's a relatively new term and it's referring to those who want to eat less meat or dairy without completely eliminating it from their diets and also buying more locally sourced animal products. And I became like interested in this because I've tried to become vegetarian and it didn't work very well for me because it just felt very restrictive and I've grown up eating meat, so it's like what I know. And I would feel bad if I ended up eating meat. But with this, I know that I'm cutting back and making a difference, but still, I still get to enjoy the meat that I like. And some of the ways that people do this is by participating in Meatless Mondays. Or eliminating red meat from their diet altogether, which I limit my red meat a lot. And you also try to eat more plant-based proteins instead of meats. And everyone who does this does it a little bit differently. And UNCW also refers to this as plant-forward diets.
And especially with campus dining, that's the phrasing that you'll see is plant forward diet. And that's what that means is it doesn't mean that it's not going to contain any animal products, but it means that meat or animal products will not be the star of the show. It'll be a very plant heavy meal with maybe a little bit of animal products, used as flavoring or something like that. But it's not going to be what I think of as a traditional American meal of like a giant serving of steak or something like that.
Okay. So what's the difference between a flexitarian, vegan, and vegetarian? So Annie, did you want to talk about that? Because Annie is a vegetarian.
Yeah, so I've been either a pescatarian or a vegetarian my whole life. So vegetarian is just, it's kind of a step, it's in my head, I kind of think about it as like a triangle, like it's like flexitarian and then you limit a little bit more and you're a vegetarian and then you limit a little bit more and you're a vegan. So with vegetarians, they typically try to eliminate all meat and all seafood from their diets, but they'll still eat things like dairy and eggs. So I know for me, a lot of my protein does come from things like dairy, eggs, nuts, and beans, especially a lot of those things. And then I mentioned pescatarian. Pescatarian is kind of in between flexitarian and vegetarian. And that's somebody that pretty much tries to eliminate all meat products, but then doesn't eliminate seafood. So it's kind of a mix of the two. And different people have different ideas of what, like, whether seafood is considered meat or not. But yeah, I grew up in a family where all of my siblings are vegetarian, and I have a lot of siblings, but my parents actually were more flexitarian. So it was kind of funny how it worked because my parents would be making vegetarian food for all of their kids, but then they would every once in a while have like meat if we were out at a restaurant or something. So they really were almost vegetarian, but would still eat meat occasionally. And I think that flexitarian is a really good way to describe the way that they have that their diets have been for a long time. And then vegan, one of my sisters has been a vegan for a while. And that's kind of one step above vegetarian. And that's when you eliminate all meat and seafood products, all dairy products. And then some vegans even eliminate things like honey. They just don't want to eat anything that had to do with an animal or any sort of creature. And yeah, so that's just kind of the difference between the three of those different diet types.
And if I could jump in here, one of the things that I'll talk to students about is that if a student is a flexitarian or a pescatarian, or even if they're a vegetarian who's still eating like dairy or eggs, there are not a lot of like nutrient deficiencies that I'm going to be really concerned about. But if someone is a really strict vegan and they're not eating any animal products, at that point, they will need to take a vitamin B12 supplement. B12 is an essential vitamin that our bodies need to function appropriately, but it's pretty much only found in animal products. You can find it in some like nutritional yeasts and things like that, but that's just something that I want to make students aware of, that I won't really encourage that, or students don't need to be worried about it if they're sometimes having animal products or they're still incorporating dairy or eggs. But if they are cutting out all animal products, then they definitely want to look into a B12 supplement to make sure they're getting that.
Okay, so how does eating less meat help the environment? There's a bunch of different ways that it can help, but it can reduce water usage, greenhouse gases, and it can also feed a lot more people. So by replacing just one meal, you can make a huge difference, because nearly half of the water in the US goes to raising animals for food. And it takes about 2,400 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat, and about 25 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of wheat. So as I said, it ranges between 2,000 and 8,000 gallons of water to produce meat, to produce beef specifically. And a lot of the water is used also to grow the grass and grain for cows' food. And 1 gallon of cow's milk uses 1,950 gallons of water. And in comparison, 1 pound of tofu only takes 302 gallons of water. And then 1 pound of unprocessed oats takes 290 gallons of water. So by eliminating meat and milk from our diet, we can save more than 50% of our water and rainforests and marshes, and also pollute the waterways less, because then we won't have as much cattle, which produces runoff and goes into the waterways and pollutes it. And as for greenhouse gases, livestock is responsible for about 14.5% of the global greenhouse gases emitted. And one cow can produce 220 pounds of methane, and methane is 28 times more potent than CO2. So by having methane, it's much worse for the environment. And greenhouse gas emissions have increased 10.1% since 1990 in agriculture alone, which is a lot. And reducing emissions from livestock. You can adjust feeding practices to reduce methane emissions, which we had mentioned, which is like being flexitarian, vegetarian, vegan. You can also control manure decomposition, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And you can capture the methane from cows and use that as a renewable energy source. So for the manure composition, you can either have it with oxygen or without oxygen. And without oxygen, it's an anaerobic biological activity, and that produces methane. And with oxygen, it's aerobic, and that produces CO2. And since CO2 is less potent and it's not as strong as methane, it's not better, but it's not as harmful to the environment as methane is. So by making it go into CO2, it's better for the environment.
Jake, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How do you, what is the method to add oxygen to the decomposition process?
I don't know the answer to that.
Oh, that's all right. I just wondered.
So the idea is compost typically has some sort of that's why you flip the pile over, because you're not just leaving it so that the underneath part doesn't get any oxygen. So that's where methane comes from landfills, because it's just all this stuff sitting there and rotting. So it can either be as simple as turning it over, or if you're doing something in your backyard and you have a small pile, or even some larger facilities have this, where they have PVC pipes underneath the piles of manure or compost or whatever it may be, and actually pump air into it so it goes into the pile. We saw a pile catch on fire last week because it was so hot and we were blowing. It was on purpose, but it was really cool. So yeah, that's a really good question. It just literally just takes exposing it to air somehow.
Thank you. I need to get home and flip my compost pile.
Me too.
Okay. So it can help end like world hunger because agriculture uses 3.5 billion acres of land, and 3.5 billion acres of land can feed 10 billion vegetarians, but only 2.5 billion meat eaters. And there's 800 million people that do not have enough food. So easily that would be enough food for everyone. And that's because livestock is fed 60% of the world's corn and barley and 97% of the world's soy meal. So eating on a plant-based or plant-forward diet does not have to be expensive, which a lot of people think it is. I originally thought it was. But on average, they save about $23 a week on groceries, and a lot more proteins can be more affordable, like beans, lentils, chickpeas, and other legumes. And the price of meat has increased more than 40% in the past 10 years. But one of the things that are expensive are mock meats and cheeses, but those are not necessary. Like me personally, I'd rather not eat those because I don't like them as much. I'd rather just eat like something with protein in it already and then eat meat, which is why this diet works best for me. And since eating meat is not as healthy as like a plant forward diet, healthcare costs have gone down for those people. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, Annie, being a vegetarian and costs and stuff.
Yeah, I think that when I came to college, I was surprised at the amount of money I was spending on groceries because I thought I would be spending more. And not because I was like I had been buying meat or anything, but just because I'd never been grocery shopping for myself. And now that I'm living with two of my friends, and they're both kind of flexitarian, and we cook most of our meals together, so they end up being vegetarian most of the time. And so when we buy our groceries, we don't really buy any meat. And I remember in the beginning they were both like, "Wow, that's so cheap! Like I can't believe that was so cheap." And I think that, yeah, like Jake was saying, for me, I'm not huge into like fake meat and things like that. I typically I love beans and lentils and chickpeas. Like I make those in the majority of my meals probably, and eggs and things like that. And because I haven't eaten meat in so long, I think that I don't really feel like something's missing from my diet. So what Jake was saying about like those not being necessary to have a balanced diet, I totally think that's true in my own experience. That I feel like I can spend a very small amount on groceries and still be like feeling very fulfilled with every meal that I eat.
And I would, if I can also contribute on this slide a little bit, this is something that I will talk to students about all the time because meat is very, very expensive. And in what we call kind of the typical American diet, there's way more of it than we actually need. And so with a lot of my students, I will talk about not eliminating meat from their diets, but just reducing the amount that they're eating, maybe cutting down their portion sizes. And I will talk about, getting ginormous chicken breasts, and I don't really need all of that in one meal. So I can either cut that in half and make that last for 2 different meals, or if I'm going to eat all of it in one meal, then at the next meal I don't necessarily have to incorporate any meat products as well. So I talk to students about that all the time just because saving money in grocery shopping and cooking is like one of the biggest topics that I talk about on a regular basis. Beans are amazing. They are so financially savvy. They can help stretch your food dollars so much further. And this is another area where I myself will do kind of a flexitarian thing where if I'm going to make like spaghetti, rather than using a pound of ground beef, I can use a half a pound of ground beef and a can of black beans or something like that. So I feel like beans are my most like grandma depression era money saving tip, but they're wonderful for college students. And I would also like to echo what both of you guys are saying about the answer to being vegetarian or vegan is not just to replace the meat at every meal with a processed soy version of that meat. Because when we talk about how healthy something is, for me, that's what we're really talking about is the level of processing there. So when I'm talking to someone about a vegan or a vegetarian diet, I'm like, well, you have to eat vegetables in it too. Like vegetables are what makes a diet healthy. So and particularly our on-campus chefs, they will encourage looking to a lot of like Eastern cuisines, like Asian and Indian, and places like that that are naturally very, very vegetable heavy, and tend to be more flexitarian. Again, just because financially it's smart and health-wise.
So this is what a few things that UNCW has to offer. You can find this information on the UNCW campus dining website, and 30% of all the food on campus, like on the on-campus dining locations, is either vegetarian or vegan. And some of the options they include are no meat, dairy, eggs, or honey. And a lot of the plant-forward options are centered around plant-based proteins and little to no animal protein. So for more information, you can contact Chelsea or UNCW Office of Sustainability